Let's bow our heads. Father, be with us here today and speak through me. Let it not be me, let it be you. Not my message, but your message. Untangle my thoughts and my tongue, and let it just be about glorifying you. We love you. Amen. Once, in a land far away from here, there lived a king. And this king lived in a huge castle on hundreds and hundreds of acres of land. And this king had a large family. 4 of the king's children were especially close in age, and so often you would find these 4 playing together. And no matter who it was in the family, no matter which of the kids it was, the king mainly just had one key rule that he wanted his kids to abide by. And it wasn't something like play nice, even though that would probably be a really good one. This rule had more to do with where not to go on the huge estate. Because at the back of this estate, there was a really fast-flowing river. And the king's one rule for his kids was to stay away, stay out of especially the river, but better yet, just don't even play anywhere near it. However, as you might imagine, these 4 kids generally like to test their boundaries. And so on one morning, the oldest of the 4, we'll call him rebellious, because he was kind of always wanting to test the limits. He's like, let's go down near the river and let's go and see what sort of things we can find around down there and throw stuff into the river. Throwing stuff into the river is completely safe, and we won't end up breaking Father's rule by wading in the river or even touching the river. We're just going to throw stuff. The idea sounded good to all of them, and so they went down near the river and kind of scrounged around to see what they could find. And they basically, about all they turned up with was a bunch of rocks, a few sticks, and a big tree stump. And so for the next 5-10 minutes, they had fun tossing the branches in and watching them float on by, like trying to skip the stones and heaving this tree stump into the water and kind of watching it. Then, after they finished with that, the second oldest, we can call her Curious, was looking down the river, and she thought to herself, I wonder where the river goes after it kind of goes around that little curve. She kind of wondered that out loud, and it got the rest of them thinking, I wonder what's beyond that curve in the river. And so they decided to start brainstorming. Well, we could try to go on land, but there's like way too much forest. And they're kind of running into a little bit of a roadblock until the third oldest, we can call him Practical, had an idea. We cannot break Father's law by going into the river. However, if we make a chain, Rebellious, you're the strongest, so you can brace us from the back holding onto this branch. We can make a chain and hold Curious out over the river, and so she can kind of see what goes on past, because she, as you may well know if you're curious at all, you absolutely have to have that curiosity satisfied. And the plan seemed good to all of them, and so they proceeded to make this chain with Rebellious holding on to a tree branch, and they all the way over to Curious, peering over, trying to see what was beyond that other side of the, like right after that curve. Everything was going smoothly until a fly landed on Rebellious's nose. And believing he had sure footing, took his hand off of the branch. And before they realized it, they were caught up in the rapids. And for most of that day, the river swept them away. And try as they might, they could not make it out of the river. As the sun was setting and all hope was fading, the river took a different turn now many, many, many miles downstream, and it hit a calm patch, or at least calm enough that they could pull themselves up to shore. And as they lay there kind of panting, sputtering water, getting their lungs cleared out from the ordeal, Practical spoke up and said, "We should probably make a fire because it's getting dark out and it's going to be cold." So they scavenged around and made a fire. And as the fire was going, they sat around shivering, huddled, trying to warm themselves. And they talked about what life was like back in the castle. They reminisced about their warm bed that they wouldn't be able to sleep on, and they talked about their father, the king, and how he gave really good hugs, and they really missed him. The next morning, they had an idea that they needed to split up and see what they could kind of scrounge around and find for food. And so they all broke up and went separate ways to see a little bit more around their surroundings and see if they could find any food. And then that evening they came back together with everything that they had gathered, made a fire. And this routine went on for days, days turning into weeks, weeks turning into months, until one evening, their group was down to 3. Rebellious hadn't showed up. At first, this didn't bother the kids because Rebellious, being the rebellious person that he was often a little late. But as the minutes ticked on, it became more and more apparent that Rebellious wasn't showing up. And so they decided, we need to go out and find him. So they set out, they kind of went in the direction that he had been going for the past several weeks. And they kind of just started scouting around to see if they could find him. And they were losing a little bit of hope until they came up to a clearing that they hadn't been at before, and they saw a house in the distance with the light on. Like, I wonder who lives in that house. I wonder if they know where Rebellious is. And so they hurried up, they knocked on the door. Door opened, and much to their surprise, Rebellious was the one standing on the other side of the door. "Rebellious, we were looking for you. Why didn't you come to the fire?" "Oh, I'm sorry, brothers and sisters, but I just finished this mud hut that I've been working on for the last several weeks, several months, and it just finally finished this evening, and I'm getting ready to throw a party. I've made some friends with some of the natives here, and we're going to have a party. You guys should stay. We know life in the castle was good, but we're stuck here now, and we should make the best of it." The youngest in the group, we'll call her follower, wasn't about ready to give up hope that Father loved them. And so she spoke up and she said, "Well, I kind of have been following along with all of this stuff, but I'm not really just ready to give up hope that Father's looking for us." And so the 3 of them went back to the fire. And they carried on their routine, days turning into weeks, weeks turning into months, until one evening the group was down to 2. Curious had not shown up. This bothered both Practical and Follower because Curious, while she was curious, was rarely ever late. And so they quickly decided they theorized, okay, let's go and ask Rebellious and see if Rebellious knows where she is. So they set off towards Rebellious's hut, but they didn't have to go very far because right at the opening of the clearing, they found Curious perched kind of up a little bit. The clearing was down a little hill, and Curious was perched on the edge of this hill looking down at Rebellious's house. "Curious, we found you! Why didn't you come to the fire?" "Oh, I was getting ready to come, and I was just passing over this ridge, and I happened to look down at Rebellious's hut, but I was taken aback. I was shocked because I looked down and I saw Rebellious, and he was acting in a way that would put our father completely to shame. And when father comes back, comes down the river and finds us, he needs to know what sort of son Rebellious has become. So I'm sitting here, I'm keeping a good mental track of everything that Rebellious has done that I've seen so far. And when father gets here, he's going to be able to have this list, and he's going to be able to give Rebellious a good run, good smacking. Practical thought for a moment, and then he said, is this really what you want to do with your life? You want to focus all of your energy and attention on what Rebellious is doing? Absolutely. I just can't even fathom the sort of stuff that he's been doing. It's just so anti what Father would want for us. And seeing that they couldn't convince Curious, Practical and Follower went back to the fire pit. A few more weeks went by, and Follower showed up one night, and she was all alone. And it was lonely being all alone. And so she decided she would go and ask Curious and Rebellious where Practical was, but neither of them had seen him. And so she kind of gave up, and she went back to the fire pit for a very lonely evening. The next morning, the thought entered her mind, I was kind of looking out in the forest. I wonder if Practical happened or might be over by the river that washed us down. And so she decided to look for him in the other direction. And as she came up to the river, she spied Practical waist deep in the water, trying to pull stones and try to put stones in, but he was having very limited, almost no success, because for every 2 rocks he'd put in place, one of them would roll away, the current would take it. And for every group of rocks that he kind of braced together, the water would just come up and over it. She waded out into the water. Practical, what are you doing? What are you doing? Oh, Follower, I'm glad that you found me. You can help. It was my fault that we washed down the river, and so I'm trying to make a path back up the river. You should stay and help me, because together we can get this path back up the river, and then we can all make it back up to the river, back up to where our Father lives. But Practical, I don't mean to be the downer in the group, but what you're doing is not all that practical. We were washing down this river for the better part of a day, and we have no idea even how far up it is. Oh, but I have to try. Well, I'm not trying to be practical either, but have you tried going up on land? It's one of my, usually the practical one, but this thought's nagging in the back of my mind. Oh, I've tried going up on land. The forest is just way too thick. Up the river is the best way to go. And besides, there was many forks and stuff in the river, and I don't really remember. I don't think I could figure them out on if we were going up on land, because we'd have to cross in a bunch of treacherous spots, but I think I can remember it if we go up the river. Seeing that there was no way of convincing Practical out of this idea of his, Follower left the river and went back to the fire pit. And for the next few evenings, as she was there alone, she got caught up into her thoughts, wondering, never completely giving up hope that Father was looking for them, but doubts started coming into her mind that maybe they were there forever. At this moment, we're going to pause from this Max Lucado-inspired tale and bring ourselves back a little bit closer to home. Back to about 3 years ago here in the Treasure Valley, as I was doing a study, as I was reading the Bible, and something in this series of parables. I had read them dozens of times before, but this time something new stood out to me. So if you have your Bibles, turn with me to Matthew chapter 13, and we're going to start in verse 44. And as you're flipping the pages or as the apps are opening up and loading, I'll give you a little bit of background on to what's prior to the passage that we're going to focus on. Matthew 13, for those who are a little bit more familiar with kind of how Matthew is laid out, chapter 13 is a series of parables, most of which are about the kingdom of heaven. The chapter opens up with the parable of the sower and the seed. And then following that, Jesus explains that the sower is sowing on different types of soil, and these different types of soil represent the different types of hearts and how receptive people are to God's message. Then it moves on to the next parable, which is commonly known as the parable of the wheat and the weeds. And this parable is the first one in the chapter to distinguish itself as being specifically about the kingdom of heaven. And following that, there's two short parables, one about a mustard seed and one about a woman baking with yeast and how the yeast permeates through. And then the chapter takes a little bit of a turn, and the disciples and Jesus kind of go into a house. And the disciples wonder and ask Jesus, we just heard these parables and you were talking about all these different things. We're kind of a little confused about the parable of the wheat and the weeds. Could you explain that one for us? So Jesus goes into his explanation. And then immediately following this explanation, we come to verse 44, which reads, "The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that a man discovered hidden in a field. In his excitement, he hid it again and sold everything he owned to get enough money to buy it." We're going to throw the next parable in alongside this one because they both have a lot of similarities. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant on the lookout for choice pearls. When he discovered a pearl of great value, he sold everything he owned and bought it. Prior to this morning, or this particular morning that I was studying, I had read and heard these parables numerous times. I've heard them explained that we need to be like the man in the field, searching and searching so we can find the treasure. And we need to be like the merchant, always on the lookout for choice pearls. But as you're potentially aware, there's not really much of an ending to either of these parables. And that kind of has bothered me a little bit, because what happens after the fact? What happens after the man has, the man who discovered the treasure, what happens when he doesn't have anything but this field and this box of gold coins is in my imagination? Like, he doesn't have a house to go back to sleep for the night. Like, what's going to happen? And then there's what's going to happen to this merchant who also has absolutely nothing but this probably decent-sized pearl. I could answer my own questions and say, well, the man who has the treasure in the field, he can kind of sell off a little bit of use some of the gold coins, some of that treasure to buy himself a lot of this stuff back. And so then he'd have the treasure and a house and other stuff. But the guy with the pearl is kind of stuck. Because if you think about it, you can't, a pearl is not going to be nearly as valuable if you cut it all up into smaller sub-pearls or little pieces, because it just kind of defeats its value. So the guy with the pearl he's kind of stuck. He has absolutely nothing. And only two thoughts really could come into my mind as I'm thinking about what might the guy with the pearl do. The first thing that came into my mind is that he could kind of go into hiding and get this pearl. But as you saw moments ago, the picture of Gollum might be a picture that could describe a little bit about what that outcome might be. Because he could go into hiding and he could treasure this pearl above everything else. But if you're familiar with The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, that storyline doesn't really end out so well for Gollum. And the ring ends up taking his life. He can't let it go. The other option for the merchant, the one that most people, if they were thinking about this in that time period, might go, is the merchant could be the merchant that he is, and he would go to the place that this pearl has the most value, and he would then sell it and recoup plus a significant profit what this pearl was worth, what he knew it to be worth. However, that was all my thoughts before this particular morning, and as I was looking at these passages. And as I was reading these passages, I realized, wait a second, the story continues on. If you have your bulletins and you see that the story, this passage is in the bulletin, there's actually a section divider, but in the study I was doing, there wasn't that section divider, and I realized there's another parable afterwards. And this other parable that comes afterwards has a little bit more detail, and it has a different perspective. So let's read the third parable in this series and see what different nuances it brings to this set. Because this third parable shares some similarities with the first two, but it has some key differences. Verse 47, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a fishing net that was thrown into the water and caught fish of every kind. When the net was full, they dragged it up onto the shore, sat down, and sorted the good fish into crates, but threw the bad ones away. That is the way it will be at the end of the world. The angels will come and separate the wicked people from the righteous, throwing the wicked into the fiery furnace, where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This third parable, it does kind of have a little bit of similarity with the other two, but its perspective is completely different. I had been looking previous to this morning at how the parable of the man in the field who finds the treasure and how the parable of the merchant, how it was from my perspective. But this third parable is clearly from God's perspective. And so what would happen if we look back at all three of these parables, but instead of looking at it from our perspective, we look at them from God's perspective? So let's do that. Let's go back to the beginning and look at these parables and think about them from God's perspective. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure that a man discovered hidden in a field. Our first clue is that the kingdom of heaven, and most of the parables that are attributed to the kingdom of heaven have God showing up in some way, shape, or form. So here we have the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure. That's an interesting play on words, because if we take this parable from God's perspective, looking down from heaven, we have the field of the universe. And we have a little speck in that field called the universe, called Earth. And from God's perspective, that is a treasure. And in God's excitement at finding this treasure, he hides everything and goes back and he sells everything that he owns to buy that treasure. It's a really profound thought. Let's go to the next parable. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant on the lookout for choice pearls. When he discovers a pearl of great value, he sold everything he owned and bought it. God's looking down and he's looking at earth. He's looking at us. He's looking at rebellious. He's looking at practical. He's looking at curious. He's looking at follower. And he's looking at you. He's looking at me. And he's seeing pearls of great price. And when he discovers these pearls, he sells everything he owns. He sends Jesus down and buys us back. It's an absolutely amazing thought to think about when we read these parables. And then going to the third parable, the one that kind of started us down this road. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a fishing net that was thrown into the water and caught fish of every kind. When the net was full, they dragged it up onto the shore, sat down, and sorted the good fish into crates and threw the bad ones away. That is the way it will be at the end of the world. the angels will come and separate the wicked from the righteous, throwing the wicked into the fiery furnace where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. This third parable kind of gives a bookend on the series of parables because it relates back and has a lot of similarities to the parable of the wheat and the weeds, where Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven is like a person sowing, and then that night his enemy came and sowed weeds where he sowed wheat. And then as everything was growing together, the servants come and say, we know that we planted wheat here, but what are all these weeds doing? And Jesus says, let them all grow together. And then when the harvest comes, we're going to harvest and then we're going to sort out. And then this parable has kind of the bookend. Kingdom of heaven's like a fishing net. Everybody is going to be pulled together, and then God's going to sort out his treasures from all that dirt. And as I'm thinking about this idea, these thoughts, another thing hit me, because the passage that I was studying that morning still keeps on going. It doesn't actually stop at the end of that third parable. So let's keep on going and read the last little bit of the passage. Jesus then asks his disciples, do you understand all these things? Yes, they said, we do. And I want to pause here for a moment, because more often than not, as you're reading through the Gospels, Jesus says, tells his disciples, what do you think about this? Or he shares this parable, and the disciples kind of stand back and they scratch their heads. They're like, we have no idea what you're talking about. But for some strange reason, they answer at this point, yes, they said we do. And that just kind of baffles my mind, and it kind of makes me stand back and laugh and say, like, they got it. But do they really get it? Like, when we read these passages, do we really understand all of what's been packed into these stories? Does the idea that Jesus, God, coming down and paying the ultimate price, and Jesus dying on the cross for you and for me, do we really understand these things? And then the passage concludes by saying, and then he added, every teacher of religious law who becomes a disciple in the kingdom of heaven is like a homeowner who brings from his storeroom new gems of truth as well as old. This is one of those interesting kind of extra thrown in parables, because it's attributing itself to the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is like this homeowner who goes in and he brings out old truths and he brings in new truths and he puts them together. And so as I read that, I'm thinking, the thought came to my mind, we really don't have to say these parables are either from God's perspective or from our perspective. We can say all these parables can be from both perspectives. We can go back to the beginning and we can say the parable of the treasure in the field can be like us searching and searching and searching for that treasure. And once we find it, we sell everything. But it can also be like God looking down on this universe and saying, there's that treasure on earth, and I must have that treasure. It can be like the parable of the merchant who goes and he is always on the lookout for these choice pearls. And as soon as he finds it, he's like, I got to have that one because it's valuable. And we can apply that to our own lives, because what the pearl that matters above everything else? And while there's a few ideas that you can have as answers, everything always for us is going to point to Jesus. Jesus is the pearl, the thing that matters most, because after our own lives, after the end of time, what's going to matter is not how much stuff we had or how much material treasure we have, but it's going to be our relationship with God. And if you think about that idea a little bit further, what's the only treasure that you can have fully in your own life, but then be able to share around with everyone? And it's Jesus. Having a relationship, personal relationship with Jesus, and then sharing what he's done for your life. But then at the same time, from God's perspective, looking down, we are God's pearl of great price. And he sends Jesus, though Jesus comes willingly down to save us, to buy us back from the sin we are trapped in. And then the third parable, from our perspective, we're either good fish or bad fish, but we're kind of, if you flip it around and put us in a different role, there's a lot of good and bad that's going on in our lives or in the world around us. And it's up to us to kind of sort out the good and the bad, because we become like what we focus on. And it's much better for us to sort out the good from the bad and to focus on the good. And it's fairly easy to see the third parable from God's perspective at the end of time, looking down, gathering everybody together, and then sorting out the good fish from the bad fish, or as in another one of his parables, the sheep from the goats. And then it still baffles me, because you understand all these things, disciples? Yes, we do. Maybe move on to the next one, but it's do they really understand it? It's just baffling. Because if we take all of these parables and this idea, we can finish the story. Because back at the castle, the king is looking down and he sees 4 of his children playing by the river. And he sees rebellious, curious, practical, and follower fall in the river. And his heart breaks. He calls for his oldest son and he says, Jesus, will you go down the river and save them and bring them back? Jesus says, I will go. So Jesus walks down to the river, and he steps in. The current is strong, but Jesus is stronger. And the river doesn't sweep him away. He slowly makes his way down the river, searching for signs of life, searching for his brothers and sisters, seeing if there's any sign of where they might be. And he keeps going down until he reaches Practical, barely past that calm stretch of river, still trying to make this path back up the river. Practical, what are you doing? I'm trying to make a path up the river. I got us all into this mess and we're all down here because of me, and it's up to me to get us home. Practical, you're not strong enough to do this, but I am. Climb onto my shoulders and I will carry you home. Next, Jesus goes up on shore and he finds follower at the fire pit. And as soon as follower looks over, oh no, Jesus, the river swept you down here too. No, follower. The river didn't sweep me down here, but Father sent me down here so that I could bring you home. You guys aren't strong enough to get back up the river, but I am. Climb up on my shoulders, and I will carry you home. Next, Jesus comes to Curious, still perched on that hill, still making that list of everything that Rebellious was doing wrong. And Jesus comes up to Curious. What are you doing? Oh, Rebellious is down there. I'm making a list. You need to go back and get Father and bring Father here so he can see what sort of son Rebellious has turned out to be. Curious? You really need to let Rebellious go and focus on the Father. Focus on the King. Let your relationship be with him, not your relationship be based on someone else and their turning away. Be your own person and just let Rebellious go. But I don't think I can. I've been here so long. I've been so focused on writing this list. I don't think I can do it. I understand kind of what you're saying, but I don't think that's for me. Curious? You might not be strong enough to put the list away, but I am strong enough to help you get back to Father. Climb onto my shoulders, and I'll carry you home. Lastly, Jesus comes down and he knocks on the wood hut door, and Rebellious opens up. Oh, Jesus, you're right on time. I'm getting ready to start another party. Well, that's great, Rebellious, but I'm here to take you home. Father's been missing you, and he wants you to come back. Oh, but Jesus, there's no way for us to get back up the river. We've been trying a bunch. We tried a lot of times, and then we just kind of gave up, and we're here now. And so we are just making the best of it. But Rebellious, life is more than partying. Life is more than this hut that you have, because this hut is nothing in comparison to what the mansion that Father has is like. But Jesus, we can't get back. Rebellious, you might not be able to get back, but I am able to get us back. Climb onto my shoulders, and I'll carry you home. Friends, today, the question is lingering for us. The question, will you climb onto Jesus' shoulders and let him carry you home? This story doesn't have the ending because it's for all of us in each moment to be making that decision. Are we going to trust on our own abilities, or are we going to climb on Jesus' shoulders and let him carry us home?